Vittorio Morfino is a full professor of history of philosophy at University Milano Bicocca, director of the Master in Critical Theory of Society. He's also been visiting professor at several universities in São Paulo, in Paris at Panthéon-Sorbonne, and in Cordoba and so on. He's also the author of numerous books on Spinoza, Hegel, and especially lately Marx, as he tells me. For example, Il tempo e l'occasione, Il contro Spinoza Machiavelli, Il tempo della moltitudine, plural temporality, transindividuality, and the aleatory between Spinoza and Althusser, L'immagine Spinoza in Germania da Leibniz a Marx, and so on. The latest one is Intersoggettività e transindividualità, materiali per un'alternativa, which was published last year. Please, today the name of the talk is the Spinoza-Hegel relationship and the Althusserian path. Please.
Thank you so much to the organizer for having invited me. It has been a great pleasure to be with you in these days. So, in 1979, Pierre Macherey, a French philosopher deeply connected to the Althusserian group, published an essay that constituted a point of no return in the interpretation of the Hegel-Spinoza relationship. If until then, as Manfred Walter writes, works on Spinoza and Hegel have simply reproduced, paraphrasing them, the verdicts pronounced by Hegel, with Macherey a new perspective opens up, summarized by the title of the preface to the first edition, The Alternative. From a merely theoretical point of view, Spinoza is no longer a philosophical embodiment of the not yet of which Dipesh Chakrabarty spoke, to acquire the full title of a now, of an alternative to Hegel. Of course, the terms not yet and now do refer to a simple and unique timeline of which Spinoza and Hegel would occupy successive segments. Proposing a Hegel-Spinoza alternative means not only rejecting the Hegelian reading of Spinoza as the locus of a misunderstanding, but also rejecting a unitary, evolutionary, and progressive conception of the history of philosophy. Hegel ou Spinoza fills a very special position within what we might call the Althusserian moment. It is the text that closes this period. The last text published by Althusser in Maspero Theorie series. The series opened by 4 Marx and in which appeared immediately after reading Capital. As is well known, the murder of Helen Rittmann, the 6th November 1980, condemned Althusser to silence and dissolved his group. Perhaps precisely because of its position, the book has acquired a kind of paradigmatic value of the Althusserian school's relationship with the two authors. The Althusserism is both Spinozist and anti-Hegelian. I proposed, on this occasion, to reconstruct Althusser's reading of the Hegel-Spinoza relationship while avoiding 2 possible biases. The first, that Macherey's reading represents Althusser's position tout court and without discrepancy, making the maître a kind of expressive cause of the pupil. 2, that Althusser thought is an eternal moment without becoming, which hasn't no deviation or evolutions. I will propose a path through Althusser's writings, from his doctoral thesis to his last writings, focusing on his use of Spinoza thought, of Hegel thought, and of their relationships, bearing in mind that at stake is not the historical philosophical reconstruction of the authors, but a remodulation of Marxism. Let us therefore begin with the doctoral thesis, Du contenu dans la pensée de Hegel. In a recent book, Jean Matisse devoted a chapter to the image of Spinoza in Althusser's dissertation. According to Matisse, in this period, Althusser did not have first-hand knowledge of the Spinozian text. The source of his image of Spinoza is precisely the Hegelian philosophy, according to which Spinozism would be the philosophy of a substance incapable of becoming a subject, of an abyss in which particularity and individuality are merely dissipated. A source reinforced by the Kojevian reading of Spinoza. I quote Kojev, "I have already said Spinoza's system is the perfect incarnation of the absurd. Why? Because he says that the concept is eternity. Consequently, Spinozist absolute knowledge, too, must be eternity. That is to say that it must exclude time. In other words, there is no need of time to realize it. The ethics must be thought, written, and read in a trice. And that is the thing's absurdity," end of quote. In the Althusserian dissertation, we find the clear traces of this twofold derivation. However, what is perhaps more interesting to emphasize is the fact that Spinoza's interpretation is constructed in polar opposition to that of Hegel. The dialectic of content in Hegelian thought draws, according to Althusserian movement, from void to plenitude, to the plenitudo temporum. In this sense, in Althusserian interpretation, 1. Hegel thought is not theological, since the place of origin is void. 2. It's not possible to distinguish method and system in it a la Engels, in the way in which Engels distinguished it. Althusser's Hegel is thus a philosophy in which the void of origin constitutes the mother of the becoming of the content. On the contrary, Spinoza thought, I quote, begins with God and only develops a content that is already given at the origin, end of quote. Hegel renverse Spinoza. I quote, the void Hegel expressly sets out to eliminate is not its own truth. The truth of the void is the very being of the void. It is the content of what is negated. In other words, negation itself as a content, it is negation of, and so contains the term it negates. In a further passage can be detected the influence of Kojev, a variation of the influence of Kojev. I quote, before Hegel, philosophy had not succeeded in including the philosopher in its field of reflection. Spinoza, in any case, resolutely ignored the problem. So, the Spinoza that appears in the dissertation is not only a Spinoza seen through the lens of Hegel and Kojev, but also constitutes the Hegel's opposite pole in terms of the dialectic of content. Thus, in the dissertation, the Hegel-Spinoza relationship is posited in terms that are entirely internal to the Hegelian tradition. When exactly do the terms change? When Althusser builds a different image of Spinoza external to that produced by the Hegelian tradition. This different image is made possible on the one hand by the political break with Hegelianism, a Stalinist political break, and on the other by the study, which presumably took place around the 50s, of Spinoza's philosophy, attested by the presence in the archive of more than 600 fiches de lecture. However, there is no trace of a different interpretation of Spinoza before the 60s. It is in the course on Machiavelli of 62, as Esteban Dominguez has pointed out, that we find the first traces of an original reading of Spinoza. In particular, in the paragraph devoted to a theory of appearance, Althusser repeatedly emphasizes emphasizes the proximity of Machiavelli and Spinoza's position on the issue of appearances in politics. The style is telegraphing, as it is obvious for notes in preparation for a course. I quote, "Men judge by their eyes and not by their hands," very Spinozist category of imagination. Spontaneous appearance of man linked to the present, to the immediacy of the present. See Spinoza. Appearance of the second degree, religion, same style as in Spinoza, but not reflected. In Spinoza, religion appears as ideological reflection on spontaneous imagination. That the question of the imagination in its double epistemological and political side was a privileged access route to Spinoza's thought is confirmed by a lecture, Psychoanalysis and Psychology, which Althusser gave as part of the 63-64 seminar on Lacan. Althusser builds there a fundamental alternative on the question of imagination through Descartes and Spinoza. The foundation of psychology depends in Descartes on the ego's possibility of not being the space of transparency that, I quote, constitutes it as a subject of truth, a subject of objectivity. In this sense, according to Althusser, the passion of the soul is a treatise of theoretical pathology in which, I quote, the psychological subject becomes the place where the relationship between the subject of truth and the subject of error is played out, end of quote, pivoting on the conceptual pair of attention-freedom. But what happens to this psychological subject in Spinoza once the subject of objectivity has been abandoned? In Spinoza, the passion of the soul, instead of opening up to a psychology, that is to a pathology of the subject of the objectivity, does not open up to what we might call open up to what we might call a theory of the imaginary, end of quote. Imaginary, that is, a totality in which psychological functions are inserted and from which they are constituted. It is interesting to remark that this real break with Spinoza's image in the Hegelian tradition take place in Althusser on the concept of imagination. However, both the course and the seminar remain confined within the walls of the École Normale. The first significant public reference to Spinoza is to be found in 4 Marx, in the article on the young Marx. In a footnote, but an extremely important one, the question is posed precisely in terms of an alternative between 2 different genealogies of Marx thought on the issue central to Althusser of rupture and change, break, la coupure, change of terrain. The footnote is on Aufhebung. Aufhebung, writes Althusser, presupposes a substantial continuity of a process containing its own future in germ, in its own interiority. Hegelian supersession presupposes that the later form of the process is the truth of the earlier form. But Marx's position implies, on the contrary, that science constitutes in its very meaning a rupture with ideology, and that it sets itself up in another terrain. Therefore, science can by no criteria be regarded as the truth of ideology in the Hegelian sense. If you want a historical predecessor to Marx in this respect, we must appeal to Spinoza rather than Hegel. Spinoza established a relation between the first and the second kind of knowledge, which presupposed precisely a radical discontinuity. Although the second kind makes possible the understanding of the first, it is not its truth, end of quote. This distancing on the decisive question of the break science ideology has also an impact on the question of the Hegel-Marx relationship with regard to the theory of history and society. Particularly, in this article Contradiction and Overdetermination, which is all about the antithesis, simple contradiction, overdeterminate contradiction, Hegel and Marx occupy the two poles of the antithesis. At center stage is the question of Hegel's reversal and the weight of this metaphor. Analyzing the postscript to the second edition of Capital, Althusser shows how, I quote, the metaphorical expression of the inversion of the dialectic poses not so much the problem of the nature of the objects to which the same method is to be applied, but precisely the problem of the nature of the dialectic in itself, that is, the problem of its specific structures. End of quote. These differences in structure between Hegelian and Marxist dialectic have their roots, according to Althusserian, in a different theory of time. Now, in order to build this Hegel-Marx antithesis, Althusser makes use of the Hegel of the phenomenology of spirit and of the philosophy of history. In the phenomenology of spirit, I quote, the past is never more than the internal essence in itself of the future it encloses. This presence of the past is the presence to consciousness of consciousness itself, and no true external determination. A circle of circles, consciousness has only one center, which solely determines it. End of quote. In the philosophy of history, all historical societies are constituted of an infinity of concrete determinations, from political laws to religion via custom, habits, financial, and so on. However, none of these determinations is essentially outside the others, not only because together they constitute an original organic totality, but also and above all because this totality is reflected in a unique internal principle, which is the truth of all those concrete determinations. End of quote. Althusser gives the examples of Rome in which its mighty history, its institution, its crises and ventures are nothing but the temporal manifestation of the internal principle of the abstract legal personality and then its destruction. Consciousness in phenomenology and principle in the philosophy of history define the uniform quality of the temporality of an epoch with respect to which the past, I quote, is never opaque, nor it is an obstacle, but it must always be digestible as it has been pre-digested. End of quote. To emphasize the opposition, Althusser affirmed that, for Marx instead, the past was no shade, it is a terrible, positive, and active, structured reality. Past as structured reality, an expression that alludes to the theory of social totality as always given complexity in the essay on materialistic dialectics, to which the Hegelian totality is opposed as, I quote, pure and sample development of one single essence or substance, end of quote. But this Hegel-Marx antithesis masks another one, the construction of an internal antithesis within Marx's own thought, the opposition between the Marx of overdeterminate contradiction, for example, that of 18 Brumaire, and the Marx of simple contradiction, the most striking example of which is the pages of the Preface of 59. But what about Spinoza? He entered the scene in reading Capital. Both in From Capital to the Philosophy of Marx and in The Object of Capital, Althusser reserves a very special place for Spinoza in the history of thought. In the first text, he states that Spinoza, I quote, was the first in the world to propose at the same time a theory of history and the philosophy of the opacity of the immediate. End of quote. In the second, it tells us that Spinoza's philosophy introduces a theoretical revolution unprecedented in the history of philosophy, to the extent that we can consider Spinoza from a philosophical point of view the only direct ancestor of Marx. End of quote. But let us come to the core of the theoretical question. In From Capital to the Philosophy of Marx, Spinoza is used to mark the difference of Marxist epistemology, on the one hand from empiricism and the other from idealism. The central point is a distinction between the real object and the object of knowledge. I quote, "Against what should really be called the latent dogmatic empiricism of Cartesian idealism, Spinoza warned us that the object of knowledge or essence was in itself absolutely distinct and different from the real object. For, to repeat his famous aphorism, the two objects must not be confused. The idea of the circle, which is the object of knowledge, must not be confused with a circle, which is the real object." Marx took up this principle, rejecting the Hegelian confusion which identifies a real object with the object of knowledge, the real process with the knowledge process, end of quote. On this basis, Althusser declares that the famous question of the relationship between the logical order and the historical order of the categories of capital is a non-problem, or rather an imaginary problem. This is interesting, for example, the fact that Backhaus make the same thing in Germany at the light of Hegel, using Hegel instead of Spinoza. In the object of capital, on the other hand, Spinoza intervenes to solve the fundamental theoretical problem of Marx's capital, which is the problem of the definition of a structural causality. Modern philosophy offered two models for thinking this efficacy. The mechanistic Cartesian one, which, however, according to Althusser, did not go so far as to think the efficacy of the whole over its elements, and the expressive Leibnizian one, which dominates Hegel's philosophy through the syntax of the pars totalis. This is a point that has been criticized from Gérard Lebrun, dans la patience du concept, de Béatrice Longness, in Hegel et la critique de la métaphysique. It is at this point that Althusser evokes Spinoza. I quote, "The only theoretician who had the unprecedented daring to pose this problem and outline a first solution to, it was Spinoza." End of quote. Of course, at the center of the theoretical scene is the concept of structural immanent causality, according to the model whereby the effects are not external to the structure, nor are they an object or element, a pre-existing space on which the structure would stamp its mark. On the contrary, the structure is immanent to its effect. In short, the structure, which is only a specific combination of its own element, is nothing outside its effect. End of quote. It is precisely the attribution of this Spinozian theory of causality to Marx that allows Althusser to draw a line between the Hegelian theory of temporality and the Marxian one. This question is explicitly addressed in the perhaps most famous chapter of Reading Capital, the sketch of a theory of historical time, in which Hegel is used as a relevant counterexample to show, by way of difference, the Marxian novelty. Again, behind Hegel's mask lies a part of Marx's own theoretical production, as Althusser himself will openly write in the following chapter, Marxism is not a historicism, where he will construct a limit form of Marxist historicism using some passages of the introduction of 57 and Capital. But let us return to Hegel, in whose philosophy of history, according to Althusser, a conception of time marked by two fundamental characteristics is at work. One, the homogeneous continuity of time. Two, the contemporaneity or category of the historical present. These two characteristics are nothing other than the two coordinates of the idea, succession, and simultaneity in its sensible becoming. Of the two, by far, the most important is, according to Althusser, the second, the one in which Hegel's deepest thought is manifested. Indeed, the category of contemporaneity says precisely what the structure of the historical existence of the social totality is. I quote, "The structure of historical existence is such that all the elements of the whole always coexist in one and the same time, and are therefore contemporaneous. This means that the structure of the historical existence of the Hegelian social totality allows what I propose to call as essential section, a coup de sens, that is, an intellectual operation in which a vertical break is made at any moment in historical time, a break in the present such that all elements of the whole revealed by this section are in immediate relationship with one another, which expresses their internal essence." It is then, according to Althusser, a matter of thinking by difference to Hegel, a plural temporality that allows each level to be given in its own and relatively autonomous temporality. Relatively because it is articulated in the social whole. A social formation is thus an interweaving of different times of which it is necessary to think about the gap and the twist produced by the articulation of the different levels of the structure. In this construction, Spinoza seems entirely absent, except for an enigmatic sentence that closes the chapter. In fact, after criticizing the structurally synchronic diachronic pair, Althusser rescues a sense of the term synchronic. Synchronic not as the temporality of the real object, but as the temporal presence of the object of knowledge. He adds, I quote, "The synchronic is the eternity in Spinoza's sense. Le synchronique, c'est l'éternité au sens spinoziste." End of quote. Obviously, this peremptory and enigmatic statement presupposes a distance from the classical reading of Spinozist eternity as absolute simultaneity, absolute zugleich, to put it in the Hegelian terms of Glauben und Wissen. It is not the annihilation of time, but rather the knowledge of the specific relation existing between the different elements of the structure, of the whole, of the relation of the dependence and articulation that make it an organic whole, a system. 3 years later, in 1968, Althusser returned on his reading of Hegel on the occasion of a talk at Jean Hippolyte's seminar. Of course, Althusser's gesture must be read in the context of the accusation addressed to reading capital of structuralism. Summarizing the achievements for Marx and reading capital, Althusser writes, "We have found in Marx a non-Hegelian conception of history, a non-Hegelian conception of the social structure, a non-Hegelian conception of the dialectic." And he adds, "Everything we have published on Hegel actually leaves aside the positive inheritance to which Marx is indebted to Hegel. Marx has transformed the Hegelian dialectic, but owes Hegel this capital gift, the idea of the dialectic," end of quote. The fourth move proposed by Althusser is a reassessment of the Feuerbachian critique of Hegel, of which, I quote, "Marx has long been prisoner," end of quote. In Feuerbach's case, one can speak of a reversal of Hegel, but a reversal that constitutes a theoretical regression. Basically following a classical path, Althusser asserts that what Feuerbach loses in relation to Hegelian thought is the fact that there is no trace of that theory of history that we owe to Hegel as a dialectical process of production of forms. Althusser considers that Marx is indebted to Hegel precisely for this decisive philosophical category. So far, we are on familiar ground. But Althusser goes further. Marx owes Hegel much more. He owes him the concept of a process without a subject. Against Kojève, Althusser read history as a process of alienation, but whose subject is not man. The process of alienation is not limited in Hegel to human history, with respect to which the process has always already begun. Since history, I quote, is nothing but alienation of nature, which is itself the alienation of logic. End of quote. Sorry, I must continue. There is, in fact, a subject in this process of alienation without a subject, and it is the very teleology of the process. In other words, the only subject of the process is the process itself in its teleology. The beginning of the logic, the first triad, constitutes precisely the key moment for understanding Hegelian thought. I quote, "The origin which is indispensable to the teleological nature of the process must be denied the instant it is affirmed, in order for the process of alienation to be a process without a subject. The beginning of the logic is the theory of the non-original nature of the origin. Hegel's logic is the origin affirmed, negated." End of quote. In a 62 text, Elements of Self-Criticism, Althusser returns to the two works of 65 for Marx and Reading Capital in a critical manner, identifying a theoricist deviation. However, he rejects the accusation addressed at him from many sides of structuralism with these famous words. "If we never were structuralists, we can now explain why. We were guilty of an equally powerful and compromising passion. We were Spinozists." And he adds, "We made a detour via Spinoza in order to improve our understanding of Marx's philosophy. To be precise, since Marx's materialism forced us to think out the meaning of the necessary detour via Hegel, we made the detour via Spinoza in order to clarify our understanding of Marx's detour via Hegel. A detour, therefore, but with regard to another detour. At stake was something enormously important, the better understanding of how and under what conditions a dialectic borrowed from the most speculative chapters of the great logic of absolute idealism can be materialist and critical. In Spinoza, anticipated repetition of Hegel, we try to see under what conditions a philosophy might produce effects useful to materialisms. End of quote. The expression anticipated repetition is extremely interesting. It adds something new in relation to Reading Capital. It means that only after and through Hegel it is possible to grasp the theoretical meaning of Spinozian repetition. It's a kind of Nachträglichkeit. And yet without the dialectical mystification of the telos. And this is as much for the real process as for the process of knowledge. Spinoza he repeats his reading of Hegel's system as circle without end and beginning, and he writes, Spinoza, like Hegel, rejects every thesis of origin, but with this difference, that within the void of the Hegelian being, there exists, through the negation of the negation, the contemplation of a dialectic of a telos. A dialectic which reaches its goal in history. But Spinoza, because he begins with God, never gets involved with any goal, which even when it makes its way forward in immanence, is still figure and thesis of transcendence. The detour via Spinoza thus allows us to make out, by contrast, a radical quality lacking in Hegel. End of quote. It is precisely this radicality that allows Althusser to see Spinoza as the first and almost only witness of a causality capable of accounting for the efficacy of the whole over the parts, and the action of the parts in the whole, a whole without closure, end of quote. For the process of knowledge, Althusser evokes the famous phrase from the Treatise of the Emendation of the Intellect, habemus enim ideam veram, assigning great importance to that enim on which the whole phrase rests, which means rejection of the criterion. Whether the criterion is external or internal, in either case, the criterion can be rejected, for it only represents a form of jurisdiction, a judge to authenticate and guarantee the validity of what is true. Once he has set aside the idealist temptation of theory of knowledge, Spinoza then says that what is true identifies itself, not as presence, but as product, in the double sense of the term production. Wow, it's very hot. Oh, it's a physical problem. Here again, we have an anticipated repetition of Hegel, but more radical. Hegel certainly did rule out any criterion of truth by considering what is true as interior to its process, but he restored the credential of the truth as telos within the process itself, since each moment is only ever the truth of the moment which precedes it. End of quote. At the conclusion of the paragraph on Spinoza, in the elements of self-criticism, Althusser emphasizes the theoretical price paid for this detour. A Marxist cannot, of course, make the detour via Spinoza without paying for it. Indeed, you cannot find in Spinoza what Hegel gave to Marx, contradiction. And then there is an explanation of contradiction in ideology, and I leave aside, I leave aside also, it is simple to be Marxist in philosophy, where basically Althusser repeats with some variation the argument of elements of self-critique. In the second half of the 17th, Althusser no longer returned to the purely theoretical issues involved in the Hegel-Spinoza relationship. He was engaged in the political battle against Eurocommunism and in defense of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the PCF, evidently. There was a discussion on this topic. In the 80s, after the murder of his wife, Althusser disappeared from the public scene. Some of the texts written during those years were published posthumously in 1990 and 2000. In the underground current of materialism of the encounter, Hegel and Spinoza are opposed in front of the concept of void, a concept that Althusser places at the center of the so-called aleatory materialism. The reference to Hegel is extremely brief and marginal. There is only one occurrence of Hegel. The work of the negative is a fausse parole. Is in French, fausse parole, I don't know. A word, a fake word, a fake, was a fake. It is a mystification of decisive philosophical meaning of the void. The reference to Spinoza, on the other hand, is central. I shall defend, I quote, the thesis that for Spinoza, the object of philosophy is the void. This is paradoxically thesis in view of the great many concepts that are worked out in the ethics. Yet, we only need to notice how Spinoza begins. He confesses in a letter that some begins with the world and others with the mind of man. I begin with God. It's not a letter, it's a note taken by Leibniz after a conversation with Chernows. But it's not important. All of them take a path that leads to God. Spinoza shuns these detours and deliberately takes up his position in God. Hence, one can say that he occupies in advance the common fortress, the ultimate guarantee and last recourse of all his adversaries, by starting with the beyond which there is nothing. By starting... I cut all so it's very difficult. By starting with the beyond which there is nothing, is itself nothing. saying that one begins with God, or the whole, or the unique substance, and making it understood that one begins with nothing is basically the same thing. End of quote. This beginning from the whole, which is a beginning from nothing, reduced to nothingness not only God, according to Althusser and the theory of knowledge, but also religion, morality, which Spinoza destroys down to their imaginary foundations. The text is from 1982. It's very difficult for me to read the number in English. 3 years later, in the only text entirely dedicated to Spinoza, and except from L'Avenir dure longtemps, the opposition seems to disappear. Hegel and Spinoza are repeatedly juxtaposed, if not identified. Spinoza and Hegel have in common the paradox to be dogmatic philosophers who produce effects of liberation. Althusser adds, the systematic exposition has absolutely nothing contradictory about the philosophical effects produced. On the contrary, through the rigor of the concatenation of its reasons, it can not only bring the space it intends to open closer, but render its production more fruitful for the freedom of the mind. End of quote. In this sense, Althusser establishes a perfect symmetry between the Descartes-Spinoza and Kant-Hegel relationship. It's a kind of a retrospective view, but in reality, it creates something new. I drew, I quote Althusser, a close, I've more or less finished. I drew a close parallel between Spinoza versus Descartes and Hegel versus Kant, showing that in both cases, what was at stake and what was being fought for was a subjectivist, transcendental conception of truth and knowledge. The parallel went a long way. No more cogito in Spinoza, cogito, but only the factual proposition homo cogitat, man thinks. No more transcendental subject in Hegel, but a subject as process. No theory of knowledge in Spinoza, no theory of knowledge in Hegel either. Whereas Descartes presents in the form a divine guarantee, a theory of guarantee of all truth, while Kant, for his part, produces a legal theory of knowledge. End of quote. Finally, a full identification where previous writings had emphasized the opposition. Returning to the theory of the three generalities, Althusser writes, I quote, in this sense, which will be taken up by Hegel and Marx, every process of knowledge goes from the abstract to the concrete, from the abstract generality to the concrete singularity. In my language, I had very crudely called this in the passage from generalities 1 to generalities 3 via generalities 2. It's, if you want, we can speak of that then. I was mistaken that the reality aimed at by knowledge was that of a generality. It was instead a universal singularity. But it was in line with Spinoza, insisting with Marx and Hegel on the distinction between the real concrete, that is the universal singular, and the concrete of thought, which constitutes knowledge of the third genus. So, I make a little conclusion. To conclude, I would try to propose a periodization of the interpretation of the relation Hegel-Spinoza in Althusser. The first period, the relation Spinoza-Hegel is read through Hegel and Kojève lenses, and Hegel thought in the light of the concept of void of the origin as motor of the content. The second period begins in 60s. The period for Marx and reading Capital. The relation is read as an alternative, Spinoza or Hegel, Hegel as in the book of, in epistemology and in the theory of history and time. Of course, what is at stake here is another alternative, Marxist historicism or Marxist structuralism. The third period begins with a new interpretation of Hegel, 68, that is, in reality, a re-elaboration of some elements of his previous reading. This new reading produced a new reading of Spinoza as anticipated repetition of Hegel, and Hegel without teleology, which allows Althusser to take distance from a structuralist interpretation of Spinoza that ends up with the quasi-Leibnizian concept of combinatory, he used in reading Capital. The fourth. If the fourth period, we have the application of the scheme of interpretation of the first triad of the great logic to the first part of the ethics. This application produces an oscillation between the relation of opposition between Hegel and Spinoza and relation of identification. If I have 1 minute, no, it's not like Balibar that then I spoke for an hour. It's really 1 minute. But wait, a quick remark. The objection Althusser addressed to Spinoza in the dissertation, the fact that Spinoza does not justify explain in this system the position of his own philosophy, go through all the theoretical elaboration of the 70s. Of course, the Hegelian answer couldn't satisfy Althusser because he was an answer for him that was a sort of absolute historicism. He tries to answer through a theory of society, of course a conflictual theory of society, which includes a reflection on the position it occupied in the society, of the position occupied in the society by the theory. So a theory of the society which includes a reflection of the position, the theory occupied in society. I hope it's clear, but I'm not sure. It is what Althusser develops under the concept of topography and under the protection not of Spinoza, but of Machiavelli. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Lea Kuchar.
I have a question regarding Marxism, because as you already mentioned, Althusser's own theory and both like reading Capital Collective was a certain intervention in political situation at the time. It was a critique of like French Communist Party, the critique of like the Soviet model.
Sorry, I didn't understand the title of the work. You said
Reading Capital Collective. The like
reading Capital.
Yeah,
okay.
collective. Yeah, like Macherey, Baribard, yeah, students. But what was interesting in this critique of the existing Marxist practices was that they were not anti-Marxist, as Althusser says himself, like we have to reread Marx, but they were like trying to be more Marxist than existing Marxism. So my question is, what does it mean to be more Marxist than existing Marxism through the lens of this you're reading, the shift from Hegel to Spinoza? And the second question, like, how is this possible, or what implication does this have for Marxism as a specific discourse? If it can be just read through different philosophies, like we can read it through Hegel, or we can read it through Spinoza and then critique like this vision, like, is there a certain surplus like in Marxism, or it's totally then reducible to different philosophies? And like, yeah, it's just like in general epistemological dilemma of Marxism. How can you see that?
So what you ask is an enormous problem,
I know.
And I try to give a simple answer. The goal of Althusser and his group in this period was to fight against humanism, and which was, according to Althusser, a kind of Marxism, but for bourgeois. It's a kind of Erich Fromm or something like that. And historicism. So, of course, the problem was to make a space in historicism in particular, and not in Gramsci, who was a great thinker, but for example, in the Gramsci of Togliatti, in the ideology of the Communist Party, there was a total annihilation of theory in the ideology of the party. The direction of the party give the line, and then all the intellectuals take positions. The idea it was to radicalize Marxism against, from one end, the humanism of a sort of Marxist bourgeois or la page, and from the other end, from this kind of totally annihilation of theory in politics. So to try, but it's multi-faced. For example, if you read Macherey do a terrible critic of Althusser and of the operation of reading capital. He said that the philosopher of the école normale make a theory of science and a thing to change the world, but it changed nothing. So it's a real, it's a enormous problem, and for example, you can see in it, in the attack to humanism, also a critic of Khrushchev, of the limited critic of Khrushchev to Stalin. Althusser says clearly it's not sufficient a moral critic to Stalin. We must understand why the society has produced this phenomenon. So I think we can discuss a week on this. For example, I've heard Balibar saying that in reality was a kind of Stalinist position against other positions, so Italian and other. It's because Torres and Mao were near more Stalinist, and so against Khrushchev. So it's very complicated. But
okay, Anton Kabishkin, then Emilia Marra.
Yeah, so I don't know much about Althusser, I should say, but the way you characterize some of his, what he said that Marx owes to Hegel just struck me as kind of a pretty strong misreading of Hegel. I mean, several things, I guess, but one thing is that history is a process without subject, which might be true for Hegel, but I think that why, like you say that, yeah, because the history starts before man, because it starts sort of from transition from logic to nature and then from nature to spirit. But then I think in Hegel it's pretty clear that those transitions are not in any way historical and in fact not temporal, right? So he says that about the transition from logic to nature pretty explicitly, and I think it's also,
yeah, of course,
also nature to spirit. Well, he says it's not natural, but I think it's like implied there. It's conceptual, basically. It's not some kind of actual historical process. So yeah, that seems like I know. Just would maybe you would say something about this.
You want my opinion on the for example, I think what I think he understands very good of Hegel is that the substance must become a subject, but it cannot become a subject and then stop, because if it stop, it became a substance. So it cannot stop in this sense to be real a subject. And so it's a process. This seems to me, but I will not use the same argument of Althusser. I don't think that it's useful to uses the first triad or triad. I say the two, so in any case, you understand of the logic to say that. I would use, for example, Wechselwirkung. Wechselwirkung, it seems to me a real critic of Ursache. There's no more a cause, but there is a Wechselwirkung, causa sui. In the Encyclopedia, Hegel use the two together. If I remember, it's a long time that I don't read Hegel. But and also for Spinoza, I wouldn't say Spinoza begins with God. It's not true. Spinoza does not begin with God. Spinoza built God in the first part of the Ethics. He builds God. Departing from the imaginary tradition, the imaginary theological tradition.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to underline one point of your relation and ask you if you can say something more about that. Because you quoted Althusser twice, and with a sentence starting with Spinoza. So Spinoza is, on the one side, the anticipated repetition of Hegel, but on the other side, Spinoza is the only ancestor of Marx. So this is stunning for me, because on the one side, so the side of the anticipated repetition, of course we can see a contradiction, but the point is, on the anticipated repetition, what we see is the attempt to go against the tradition of philosophy as such, the history tradition as such, which we know is one of the most interesting aspects of Althusser's way of reading philosophers. On the other one, if we see Spinoza as an ancestor, it is quite straightforward. So Spinoza is historically before Marx, so it makes sense in a different way. So if you can stress this difference. And the second aspect I'd like your comment on is about Kojève, because it is true, in fact, that Kojève thinks that Spinoza's beginning is absurd. But in some way, he thinks also that Hegel's beginning is absurd. There is this beautiful quotation, I'll go by heart. He says, Spinoza's beginning is impossible because it is impossible that he has written the Ethics, because it needs to be God from the very beginning in order to be able to write down the Ethics. On the other hand, Hegel has to become God to be able to write down the Phenomenology. So if you'd like to comment on this. Thank you.
Allora, sorry. Okay, I hope not to have lost. The two affirmation are of two different periods. I've not quoted all because I was cutting all the night. So when he say is the only ancestor in Reading Capital, he says, but Marx does not know Spinoza, knows very little Spinoza. So it's not a kind of reconstruction of Spinoza as a source, is a gesture that as a sort of, there is a kind of lyric about Spinoza in Reading Capital. He says very little, but in a lyrical way, is the greatest revolution, and a lyric of theory, of course, not, but in the second elements of autocritic is, in my view, is reconstructing the past, but modifying it, of course. He's saying, I was doing that, but he's changing the terms of he was doing. because he says, in reality, what we saw in Spinoza, we saw in Spinoza because Spinoza is a repetition of Hegel. So only through Hegel we can see the true Spinoza. About I don't know what to say about that. About Kojève, it's Hegel. I say always to my student that it can appear a little bit stupid for a man to say I'm the point of the most high point of the development of humanity. But it was the first that has said that, and he was the first that puts himself at the highest point of the Weltgeschichte. So he invented the Weltgeschichte, and so it's not so stupid. It's a great gesture.
Okay. So, okay. Is there time for one more question?
Ci vorrebbe un...
Okay.
Sì, grazie.